Today we will be bringing you some more actual history. This story comes from northeastern Oklahoma in the 1880s, on the land bordering the Osage Reservation. Over the years, one by one, people would pass through this area and never be heard from again. We will be reading from the December 1962 issue of True West magazine. This story is called The Osage Terror, written by Glenn Shirley and illustrated by Robert Blewitt. So here is the story of the Osage Terror, who would prey on anyone who passed through the Osage country in the early 1880s. The Osage, a hilly timbered section of northeastern Oklahoma, came into the national limelight following the Civil War. The government purchased it from the Cherokee Indians, and herded the remnants of the once proud Osage tribe onto the reservation. In that region anything can and has happened. In July of 1883, Carl Fenwick, a New Yorker, came west for his health and settled his family at the northwest corner of the Osage Reservation. A few weeks later, he celebrated the birthday of his small daughter Katie with a feast and much merrymaking, and he presented her with a valuable gold chain and locket of antique workmanship. After dinner, Katie went to play in the woods and never returned. The alarmed father organized a search party, which combed the area for hours, but little Katie couldn't be found. That night a severe storm hit, uprooting trees and sending streams from their banks. The next morning, unable to uncover any trace of his child, Fenwick gave up, believing that she had drowned. In December of that year, George Bidders, a mail carrier, set out from Sedan, Kansas, for the town of Peru in the Osage Nation. His horse was found in the timber, the saddle and bridle missing. The following spring, Elmer Johnson went hunting in the hills and disappeared. His rifle was found with the stock broken. His hat lay nearby, covered with blood. In September of 1885, a party of hunters came upon the skeletons of 2 horses and a weather-beaten wagon that had been abandoned for at least a year. It contained the possessions of 2 men, but no trace of their bodies could be discerned. On February 12, 1886, Oscar Beach went hunting along the northern border of the reservation and vanished as mysteriously as the others. A tense gloom, shot through with anger and suspicion, settled over the country. Even the Indians feared and distrusted one another. United States Marshals were unable to solve the mystery. A railroad being built across Kansas was extended south into the Osage. It was necessary to cut through a wild promontory called Cascade Hill. For this job, the company shipped in a gang of Italian laborers under the supervision of a powerfully built Irishman named Pat Durfee, who always wore a gold chain about his neck. The first night in camp, some of the crew complained that there had been a prowler in their tents. Pat Durfee laughed at their fears, but the molestations continued, and Durfee decided to sit up alone and trap the strange visitor. About midnight he dozed. Suddenly he was awakened by something tugging at the chain around his neck. A shadowy figure dashed away in the moonlight. Durfee whipped up his rifle and fired. The marauder fell in the brush, thrashing about and screaming like a wounded animal. Durfee approached for another shot. Before he could fire, a huge man garbed in leather and skins leaped to his feet. The man seized him with one hand and knocked Durfee unconscious with the club he wielded in the other. When the Irishman came to, his gold chain was missing. Quickly he organized a posse and, with 3 Indians as guides, set out in pursuit. Blood spots on the ground showed that Durfee had wounded his attacker, apparently in the right leg. They followed the trail all night and most of the next day. Late in the evening they entered a ravine in a wild, broken section of hills, so choked with undergrowth it was almost impenetrable. The trail ended at the mouth of a cave. Without warning, their quarry launched an attack, hurling heavy stones with such unerring aim that the posse suffered 3 casualties before it could retreat. Durfee fired until his rifle was empty without hitting the animal-like being. As he attempted to reload, the figure leaped from the rocks and charged him, its screams echoing through the hills. Using his rifle as a club, Durfee struggled with his foe until some of the Italian hands drew knives and rushed to support him. The fierce struggle finally ended when the monster collapsed on his wounded leg and lay shrieking in diabolical rage. A knife plunged into the heart ended his wild cries. The Indian guides took one look at the man-animal's face and fled. The Italian laborers shuddered, and Durfee gasped as they gazed down at the most horrible features they had ever seen. The wild man's face was burned black and seamed with scars. The nose had been broken and had grown back horribly twisted. Where the upper lip had been torn away, broken teeth jutted like fangs. Shaggy hair was matted about his head and jaws. Around his wrists were heavy steel bands. From one still dangled a link of chain. Inside the cave, another ghastly sight met their eyes. On a shelf of rock sat an array of 16 grinning skulls. There was a crude fireplace, some cooking utensils, and a grass bed. Hanging from pegs driven in the wall were George Bitters's saddle and bridle and his empty mail pouch, the clothing of Elmer Johnson, the gun of Oscar Beach, and many other items from anonymous and forgotten victims. Stuffed in a crevice with several other pieces of jewelry were little Katie Fentwick's lockets and the gold chain Pat Durfee had worn about his neck. They identified the killer as Tangdon Tonke, the Panther, a Delaware half-blood who had been placed in irons for tribal crimes. He had escaped years before and was thought to have died from exposure. He lies buried in the ravine where he was captured and slain. Reprinted from Texas Rangers, December 1955. So that's it for this episode. This was a short story, but also a fairly disturbing one, about all these people, including children, who were killed by this Delaware Indian who had escaped the chains that he had been put in as a tribal punishment. He would live alone for several years and prey on these people who passed by. As mentioned, this story also appeared in a 1955 issue of Texas Rangers magazine. Although there is not much information available about the people who were killed during this time, this story also appears in Arthur Lamb's 1929 book, The Tragedies of the Osage Hills, as told by the Sage of the Osage. This book was also the first to tell what is more commonly known as the Osage Terror or the Osage Murders, which are also described in the book Killers of the Flower Moon. The books Killer of the Flower Moon, and even more so the book Empire of the Summer Moon, which is about the Comanches, were big inspirations for this channel. This channel is called Unworthy History because we read actual stories directly from old books, and other sources such as True West Magazine, which we read from in today's episode. These stories tell of people who lived much harder lives compared to what we have to live today, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support the mission of Unworthy History and help keep actual history alive, then consider joining our Patreon page or becoming a YouTube channel member. Your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode, and you will have special access to members-only videos that we occasionally release. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.